Hello and welcome. We are here to celebrate the 100th birthday of James Baldwin. How many of you have read Baldwin in your courses, have read him on your own, included them in a thesis or even a dissertation for our faculty? Raise of hands, how many of you have a relationship with James Baldwin already? Great to hear. And I'm glad that you came because James Baldwin was, thank you for the reminder to use my mic. James Baldwin was an amazing human. An amazing human, a man, a loyal son and uncle and brother, a black man, a black gay man, a black American gay man, a black American gay man who was a writer and public intellectual who expanded the genre of writing by writing so many different types of literature, from plays to poetry, from critical essays to novels. And while he was an American, he often found that clicking into his identity was often easier outside of the US. So he visited France, he visited Turkey, where he spent a long time living. And he also spent quite a bit of time living in our backyard in the Berkshires area in the Five Colleges region. From 1983 to 1986, James Baldwin was an instructor of literature at Hampshire College, right down the road. And he soon passed in 1987. So I mention all of these multiple things that James Baldwin has done because to say he's just a writer is so limiting. He's an amazing human who had quite a multiplicity. And he's an amazing human in his multiplicity that I think speaks to so many of us in one way or another. It's a reason that I consider him to be a mentor. If I were ever able to meet him in person, that would have been wonderful. But if you can kind of retrospectively make a mentor, he has been that for me. My name is Rashida K. Braggs. I am chair of Africana Studies, and I'm professor in Africana Studies as well as a faculty affiliate for comparative literature. My background is in performance and in merging different types of performance, and that is what first drew me to the work of James Baldwin. We're here today because it's his birthday, and I didn't want Williams to let that monumental moment go by, August the 2nd. This is the closest that we can kind of get to it after classes start. So I didn't want that moment to go by, but I also wanted to look at James Baldwin in a bit of a different perspective. There are multiple celebrations for his birth and life this year, but not so many focusing on James Baldwin as all of those things that I laid out before, but also as a teacher. That's what he is for me, a teacher and a mentor. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool for us to hear about how James Baldwin taught some of us? And maybe even, if we have time afterwards, to hear from some of you how James Baldwin influenced you, or if you have questions or things like that. So that was the brainchild, if you will, of this event. What have we learned from James Baldwin? And it might come from areas that we didn't even expect, right? So I'm going to structure this in a way where I've invited several of my colleagues, and we're all going to talk about what lessons we got from James Baldwin. I will start off with Ricardo Wilson. But before I go there, I wanted to mention the relationship between James Baldwin and Williams College, and James Baldwin and Hampshire College, and the Five Colleges in general. The Williams record you see on those two left-hand artifacts from October and November 1983. James Baldwin came here, he gave a talk. And if you were up a little bit closer, you would notice that the article in October, right before he came, was from our very own David Lionel Smith, a recent emeritus professor in English here. So James Baldwin has a relationship with our place, with Williams College, and a relationship with our broader region. The article on the right is from August the 2nd, 2024. So just a month or so ago, from the Massachusetts Review, really recalling those moments when James Baldwin was at Hampshire College, the people he met. I know we have some English scholars in here, like it talks about John Weidman, his relationship with John Weidman, for example. And I also should mention that in addition to this event, the special collections of the Sawyer Library has also put together a special exhibition of James Baldwin upstairs. So after this or some other time, it will be up for several months. Go take a look upstairs, because we will also see Baldwin's relationship to other important writers to us, like Sterling Brown. There's a letter between James Baldwin and Sterling Brown right upstairs. I mention all of this to kind of lay the groundwork for what Professor Wilson is going to kind of share with us, but to really highlight the ways that James Baldwin was a teacher and a mentor and a person in dialogue, even with us in this region, when maybe we wouldn't have known that or maybe not have thought about him right here, but he is. And hopefully his spirit is here today as we celebrate him. So with that, I would like to segue to Professor Wilson. And I started off by inviting our two guests, Professor Ricardo Wilson and Avery Sharp. I'll do the introductions as they come up so that you'll hear more about both of them. But I started this idea by asking them how James Baldwin was an influence for them. And I came up with particular questions that they had thought about. And so they will address the question, but they will also share a little tidbit, a specific example of that like influence that Baldwin had on them. So.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Professor Bax. Can you guys hear me? Is this loud enough? When I first got here to Williams, both Rashida and I were teaching a class on Baldwin and ended up sharing some space together with our students. And I'm really privileged to be here with you. I'm privileged to accept this call. And so, as I've said often to colleagues, friends, family, I would not be here this connected to my purpose were it not for my exposure to Baldwin in my years after college when I was sorting through the direction of my life. And that is in no way hyperbole. It was first Giovanni's Room, then Another Country, and later, though not fiction, his 1985 book-length essay, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, that spoke to the Atlanta child murders of the late 70s and early 80s, that rapidly uncovered in me a desire to dedicate my life to writing. And I imagine the article that DL wrote is at least gesturing to some of the thoughts that he was going through as he was preparing the book-length version of the essay on that, but I'm open to read that now. It was a desire that eventually led me to graduate school, later than most, to find the time and inspiration to dedicate myself to writing, and it was there that I fell in love with teaching, and in an indirect way, here to this campus and in this room. And so today, with gratitude in my spirit, I'm going to read from my novel in progress, Even Worse Than the Nightmare. In this work, two black survivalists are squatters in the woodland of an unsuspecting property owner until rumors of smoke in the mountains and the eventual discovery of a body sends the unnamed northeastern town into a frenzy. It is a contemporary meditation on notions of flight and captivity, undergirded by a subtle conversation with / translation of or revision of the work of, among others, Gwendolyn Brooks and Jorge Luis Borges. But it is also a work that would be literally impossible without the presence of Baldwin and Audre Lorde, as its title is borrowed from a conversation they had in 1984 at nearby Hampshire College. So when Professor Braggs asked me, do you have anything to say? Like, this is what I was doing, part of what I was doing on my sabbatical. So in this conversation, for those that haven't read it, Baldwin interrupts Lorde at one point to ask if what she is getting at is that, quote, she does not exist in the American dream except as nightmare. She agrees at first, noting that she is reminded of this every time she opens Jet magazine, a Kotex box, or even a prayer book. After Baldwin waxes on for an extended moment, as he is wont to do, Lord, clearly chewing on her own thoughts, interrupts him. Even worse than the nightmare, she says, is the blank, and black women are the blank. This blank, in the ways Lord intends and how it relates to or undercuts other similar reverberations, has played in my head for some time. And this short novel has been and continues to be an opportunity for me to think through that. And so here's the opening scene from this developing work. And you'll notice other echoes as well, or some may. They came by tens to work the woodland of Anne's property and an expanding perimeter beyond for the better part of 6 days. If the radar proved wrong and the rain did not come, it would be the cold and the harder ground, and soon enough the snow. So with a portal thought to be closing, on the 6th day it was decided to allow the call for volunteers and begin hauling in generators and lamps for the forensic team to work on the discovered site into the nights. An eager collection of townfolk, braced with walking sticks and rakes and the health to hike at elevation in the chill of early November, were then authorized to lightly search beyond the outer perimeter for anything suspicious. They were told to shout toward what was being treated as a crime scene's nucleus, and all were instructed to pause in their movements at the sounding of such an alarm. After the body was taken out of the ground on the morning of the 2nd day, when, with curiosity on the stretch, the scope of their undertaking had been fed and grown, the authorities agreed to not use Anne's driveway and instead route their caravan through the forested state line land behind the near 30-acre property her father had left to her 3 decades back. A blushed-faced young deputy who had known her son well went out of his way to argue for this, adamant, despite his lack of tenure and his normally quiet demeanor, that the echo of state vehicles parked just beyond this woman's front porch was of a particular cruelty. But however impalpable their presence, they were still on her land, and so that same deputy had been singled out to leave the perimeter at the close of each day and march up the slope alfalfa field to Anne's house and deliver the updates the sheriff's department was at liberty to share. Anne, ignorant of his lobbying, took comfort in sharing a space with a man that had drifted from her life, but for a moment had shared wholly in her grief. Though her property and the surrounding land held a significant portion of the town's able-bodied men and women, in those last nights of frenzy, when it was believed by most that there was a band of dark and ferocious miscreants in the woodland, all Anne truly saw was a muted glow in the thinned-out trees. On the first night of light, she came to drinking 2 fingers of whiskey and falling asleep on the couch, looking out at the subtle spectacle. Today, with the storm announced and the town sent home, news from the deputy, wet and heavy breathing, begins small. To this point, he says, they have only discovered the one body, the one dugout shelter, and the adjacent food cache. He swings his leg like a golf club to sweep rocks from the slate walk with the arch of his muddied boot. We may come back when the storm break, he says, looking down with hands clasped behind his back. To Anne, for the first time since this all began, his posture recalls the moody disappointment of the teenage boy she had once welcomed into her basement to play video games and wrestle with her son. And the body, Anne asks. His head tilts, and she is unsure if he has heard clearly with the rain cascading on the metal roof. Come on, and get up out of the wet, stepping forward and offering a hand to force the issue. With him now close and shedding water, the body, she says again, what do you know? Out of our hands, he says. In that condition, probably already sent it to the lab out of state. It had been the how long of this barely registered entanglement that had sat with her most. But the scanners now silent and the message boards full with only reverberating gossip, and the body, as he has put it, now in other hands, perhaps across borders, she senses this might be the last of their sudden and strange intimacy. Can I offer you something, she tries. No, thank you, Mrs. K. Both seem to smile at the error of her name, an abbreviation that points to a man she had been rid of long ago. It is the only name he had known for her before the body in her woods brought him again to her door, but in this moment, it feels warm and right. Her brown mutt has nuzzled past the stuffed and sun-worn packing boxes that blocked the living room window and is scratching at the glass. She points him away with a snap, turning back to the deputy as he releases the Velcro from the shoulder of his tactical vest beneath his parka to get at the phone in his breast pocket. With a flash of excitement in his brow, Anne expects that he might show a picture of his family, perhaps as an entrance to talking about the life he and her son had shared in their teens. Perhaps his oldest, who she knew took her son's name, jumping off the old quarry's cliff ledge. Instead, he asked if she recognizes a photo of a dirt-stained quilt spread on the dry ground between two of her forest trees. I do, she says quickly and quietly. After a slow breath, it's an autographed quilt from my grandmother. I often keep it on the chair of the covered patio on the walkout basement. They, she says, conscious that she too in her own mind is now speaking in plurals despite the presence of one body. They must have snagged it from there. She reminds the deputy of the detail she had shared when he first came to her porch, that she had replaced the drip pan in her grill down there several times, but hadn't noticed anything else out of place. This was true, the pans and the relative in-placeness of things. They might have gotten to a raspberry she thinks to add, but knows that just as easily could have been the deer or the early frost. Some time ago, was it, the deputy asked. My nephew had been helping me pack up the house for the sale, gesturing to the boxes. Before all that got put on hold, I must not have flagged it as gone. The black blanket has to stay in evidence, he says, and nods. And once we sort through all we've got, they're going to want you to come and make a formal statement about everything you've seen. I understand, she says, with some apology in her spirit as she looks past him to the cloud-covered mountain beyond her woodland. To be clear, they aren't interested in you. They just need to fill out the picture. It might make sense to take notes as they come to you. What she finds herself unwilling to say as the deputy stands on her porch with his eyes hidden by his hat, and weeks later when she would drive herself to the station to deliver her account in a cold, small room crowded with a recording device and 3 unfamiliar uniformed men, was that in the preceding spring, the whistle had come from the boundary, where the alfalfa runs up against the line of ash. And though she responded to the call with a brisk, confident walk from this same porch through the then knee-high crop to the edge of the woodland, she found herself shaken by the figure's emergence from the underbrush. Nor would she share that in the winter months, when what ash were left were bare, she would on occasion perceive a pair walking the distant clearing on the border of the state forest. She had convinced herself it was her mind's eye, a conjuring scraped from the circulating reports and rumors of petty theft and smoke in the mountains that her nephew was always sharing with her. She'd even imagined the face of a woman, but it was not that one, swaying silently, measuring, less than a rod from her then. That one bore a scalp shaved clean, was somehow darker and all bone at the cheeks. "Can we beg a fresh blanket, ma'am?" the woman had asked, resting an elbow on the one verdant pine in the stand of trees. There was nothing sinister, only what Anne read as weariness in the way the woman let the tree take her weight. "To wrap my husband," the woman added. "His body's cold." Anne regarded the woman, captive, as a young child might be standing for the first time before a funhouse mirror. And though she cannot remember how the arrangement was made, for they must have spoken, that evening she came to the edge of the woodland with the quilt her grandmother had sewn while on bed rest with her mother inside her, and laid it on the chest-high rung of the rusted ladder leading to the deer stand. Those months ago, as she was preparing the house for the realtor's photographer, that quilt and her grandfather's 700-pound safe were the only things of meaning she'd yet to be rid of. Her nephew had even taken the horse fence clear out the ground, just to burn it, he said, before she slapped him. The safe, which in another's life had held a serviceman-turned-pacifist collection of guns, would have taken 5 large men she did not know to move. She was prepared to leave it, but the quilt, when she recalled looking into the woman's eyes, felt like an offering. Besides, she knew her daughter had no interest in such things, a check from the sale of the property being enough, whatever enough was between them and whenever that would come. It was only the week before last, when this deputized version of her son's childhood friend first began towing his boot nervously on her porch, that she knew that by cold, the woman had meant dead. Anne is brought back to the present, staring at the shoulders of the deputy as he leans out over the balcony. "And I assume still no cameras on the walkout," he shouts over the rain. "None on the house," she says. He returns to her, replacing the phone and zipping up his parka to ready for the descent. "How's your oldest?" she asks. With the sky falling around them, Anne wonders if she really wanted to hear his name spoken, and if the deputy imagined he is saving her from something. She too, suddenly, wants a privacy and the ability for the first time in more than a week to walk the ruins he and his kind have left. She sends him, politely, to the pounding water. So I'll wrap there.
Oh. Thank you so much, Professor Wilson. One of the cool things I think about this is that some of you who have taken classes with Professor Wilson get to see another side of his oeuvre, right? You know, that he's a teacher, but he's also an artist. He's also the executive director of the Outpost Foundation, so he's able to help support a residency and an arts advocacy organization for creative writers of color. So there are ways that he's able to take the lessons that he's learned and the opportunities that he's benefited from and the influences that he's had from folks like Baldwin and Lord, and to help guide other artists in their way. And I am just so grateful for this wonderful treat of sharing something that you still are working on. This is rare. You know, a lot of people haven't heard this, and I thank you, Ricardo, for sharing work that is close to the heart. Ricardo is also the author of An Apparent Horizon and Other Stories, which was selected as a finalist for both the Vermont Book Award and the Big Other Book Award, and also The Negrescent Beyond Mexico, the United States, and the Psychic Vanishing of Blackness. And most recently, Ricardo has unearthed and edited and will introduce Troubled Lands, which is a previously unpublished collection of short fiction from Mexico and Cuba, translated by Langston Hughes in 1935. So I mentioned some of these other works, again, so that it expands your knowledge of Professor Wilson and to see his multiplicity too, in line with our great mentor, James Baldwin. Thank you again for sharing. I also have the pleasure of having another colleague and friend who was one of the folks who welcomed me when I first arrived here years ago. And he is a man of multiple talents as well. Avery Sharp is from Georgia, and he attended the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he studied bass with renowned bassists like Reggie Workman, and he soon performed with Archie Shepp and Art Blakey. Do we have a lot of like music fans in here? Just a show of hands. I need to have some music people in here. Great, yes. So you may recognize some of these names. He also joined McCoy Tyner's group in 1980 and worked with McCoy Tyner for the next 20 plus years. Avery Sharp's credits include sideman stints and recordings with jazz greats like Dizzy Gillespie, Wynton Marsalis, Yusef Lateef, Bobby McFerrin, and Billy Taylor, among many. And he's also graced his presence and his wonderful expertise here at Williams College. At Williams College, Avery Sharp was the Sterling Brown Distinguished Visiting Artist at Williams College. He was also a faculty advisor for the Williams Gospel Choir and affiliated faculty for Africana Studies. He was an artist associate in jazz, bass, and a jazz coach at Williams College for, I mean, how long were you here?
I think 9 years.
Yes.
10 years.
So I don't know if there are any students still here who had the privilege of working under the guidance of Avery Sharp when he was here with the gospel choir, but the gospel choir performance every year is like the place to go, right? And so Avery Sharp contributed to that for many years, as well as his career in jazz and helping support our small and large ensembles here. So yeah, he's come back, but he's a part of our community, and I would love to hear your thoughts on the question. So I asked Avery Sharp the question, how did James Baldwin's family and career help shape your career?
Thank you. Not only is it a 100-year birth celebration of James Baldwin, but it's also the 100-year celebration of the great Max Roach, drummer Max Roach, one of the fathers of bebop music, who was also one of my professors when I was at the University of Massachusetts. And people like Max influenced me in terms of going back and knowing the history of the music, because the more you know about the history of the music, the better you can play it. And so Max obviously was a contemporary of James Baldwin, and I think I've got to talk about the influence that James Baldwin in general, because actually I knew his brother David. I only met James one time, and I met him at a club in New York called McKell's. It was there for, I don't know how, well, it says 1969 to 1991. But one of the great things about it is that you could see the influence that James Baldwin not only had on his contemporaries, but what he had influence that and effect that he had on other artists, musicians like myself. And James' brother, David, was actually one of the bartenders at McKell's. And McKell's was kind of like, for lack of a better word, it was kind of like a black think tank in a social situation. I first played there with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. And the night that I started with Art Blakey, a young 18-year-old, Wynton Marsalis, sat in with the band. And Wynton and I became friends. We still kid each other about. He said I was really scared of Art, because I was like, I'm playing with Art Blakey, and he's played with all these guys have gone through his band, and I used to kid Wynton about being country. He's from New Orleans. I know y'all see him in a different light now. He was country. He had on plaid. I was talking to my wife about this morning. He had on plaid pants, and they were. I said, I think they were bell bottoms. She goes, yeah, they were bell bottoms. 1980. That was country. So, right after that, I went and started playing with McCoy Tyner, and I met David Baldwin, who was the bartender, and David was kind of a joyous guy. Always seemed like he was having fun, and plus he was a bartender, so he was, he always talked to a lot of people. But I started playing there about a couple times a year with McCoy Tyner, and I think the first night I played there, Wynton sat in. I think I was there for like 2 or 3 nights, and I think Betty Carter came in and sat in. Mulgrew Miller, that was the first time I met Mulgrew Miller, the great piano player. And then I started coming back there with McCoy, and I started meeting and actually looking at the people and associating with the people, because a lot of musicians would come by, and that's what McKell's kind of was. It was kind of a hangout for musicians as well. And so you would see, Roy Ayers, you see Steve Torre, you would see a bunch of people coming through and that you would meet. But then I would also meet a lot of literary people, a lot of writers. You would have fit right in. Ricardo, you would have fit right in. As a matter of fact, I would have discussions with writers. And actually, it was another bartender who was a writer and who was a friend of James Baldwin, and actually went to James's, would hang out with James at his place in France. And he and I became, good friends as well. And we would always discuss, he would always talk about the stuff that he was writing, how he got inspired, and I was saying, well, I'm inspired by, the stuff that, James Baldwin wrote. And it was really a great place, kind of like, you can't compare anything to the Harlem Renaissance, but I think there was more of artists hanging out, whether you were a writer, whether you were a visual artist, whether you were a dancer, whatever. People kind of got together and were inspired by each other. So being in that environment, one of the people I can't even think of his name, he and I used to hang out all the time. He was a writer, but he's the one that hit me to John Killens, the writer, and he said, you got to check out Youngblood. And I was like, whoa, okay, I'll check out. So you had those kind of people there that would inspire you. And I think one of the things that, and like I said, I met James Baldwin, which was...
He's actually, I just wanted to note, he's in this photo. The one on the left, he's the person on the left. And Mike McKell, that's his name, Mike McKell, so it's like doubled.
Right.
Yes. And it looks like Oscar Brown Jr. are
Right.
in that picture on the left. Yeah.
And so it was, I met, well, I played with McCoy Tyner. A lot of people don't realize McCoy's brother, Jarvis, was actually part of the Communist Party. He was the president, and Angela Davis, they were both, and I met Angela Davis because McCoy's brother bought Angela there. Just a lot of people coming through there, and I think eventually, McKell sold the McKells to David Baldwin. I think someone told me that David, I think, took it over, but I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure about that. But it was just it was really a very creative environment to be in, not only musically because you're playing with people like Art Blakey and McCoy Tyner, but you're liable to see any musician come in and sit in with us. And I'm talking to people who are writers and were aspiring and were influenced and by Baldwin. And so it was just a really creative and magical thing that was happening. I mean, sometimes, well when I first going back a little bit, when I met James Baldwin, I was struck by how small he was. That kind of, I was like, whoa. I mean, I knew that, but when you see him, you're like, oh wow, he's really small. So, but the amount of energy and the amount of talent and the amount of outlook that he had was just so inspiring. And I remember when I met him, I remember thinking of a speech that Malcolm X had given about the March on Washington. And Malcolm at the time was kind of not very flattery about the March on Washington. And I remember him mentioning, he said, it became a picnic, and he said they wouldn't let Jimmy Baldwin speak because they couldn't control him. He would be blunt and very honest. And that kind of approach as an artist has affected me in terms of, if you look at the projects that I do, they're all inspired by ancestors, some radical ancestors, Sojourner Truth, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Not my last, but before this, my recording was 400, an African American musical portrait. So it's always been kind of, speaking what's going on, being truthful, not slapping people always across the face, but just, hey, this is what's happened. I mean, James Baldwin could be a little bit more forward about how he was thinking about things, but yeah.
Thank you so much. I really value hearing the lived experiences of people, especially from eras that we weren't able to vibe with ourselves directly. So hearing about how you were like 18 and in this club and, like bumping shoulders with all of these greats and getting to know them as people too, is just so fascinating to me. And it also points to, again, this multiplicity of Baldwin, that he was not just a writer, but very much in touch with the music scene. And anyone who's taken a course with me knows that I'm really interested in literature that is infused with music. So James Baldwin would be a natural person to come to for the merging of music and literature. And I just think that it's just amazing the experience that you had, not only at McKell's, but also at Hampshire College to work with Max Roach and others. University of Massachusetts, but this 5 colleges area where you have access to all of these greats who were visiting professors at the same time as James Baldwin. So it's really wonderful that you can share some of that with us, because we didn't have direct access, but we do now through you. So thank you so much for that.
All right, so I'm going to step in here and introduce Dr. Braggs. So Rashida K. Braggs is a professor and chair of Africana Studies and a faculty affiliate of comparative literature at Williams College, and a scholar, performer who acts, dances, sings, composes music, and performs spoken word. She is a Fulbright Scholar and a co-recipient of a National Endowment of the Humanities Fellowship. Her book, Jazz, Diasporas, Race, Music, and Migration in Post-World War II Paris, investigates the migratory experiences of African-American jazz musicians in Paris from 1946 to 1963. Her performances have been supported by such venues as Jacob's Pillow, Williams College Museum of Art, the Tapper Art Gallery, if I'm pronouncing that right, and the United Solo Theater Festival. Dr. Braggs consistently interweaves her scholarly explorations with her pedagogical practices with courses like Moving While Black and James Baldwin's Song, which teaches students that performance conveys much about a society's values, patterns, and negotiations of power. Like I said before, I am happy to share a campus with you.
Thank you so much for reading my own introduction. That can get a little tricky, right? So thank you. It is a pleasure to have shared campus with both of these gentlemen. So thank you for contributing to this event. So of course I have to ask the question to myself too, right? I'm looking for folks to contribute to this, but you're probably curious as to what I have learned from James Baldwin. The first thing I think that drew me to him is his musicality, not only in the way that he writes, but in how he's written about the blues and about jazz and about like gospel and how important gospel music and gospel culture was to his upbringing, and how he wrote reviews about it, he wrote essays about it, novels, poems. It's like music is life, right? And I very much believe that. So that was what drew me to James Baldwin to start off. But the first core lesson that has really driven my work since probably maybe 2010 or 2011. 2011, I started work here, but in 2010 I came for an interview here, and I presented work on the concept of dislocated listening. And that was all from James Baldwin and his experience living abroad and having a feeling of dislocation, a separation from his culture, but also being able to listen more deeply and understand his culture that he'd left because of that dislocation. And that was all through music, through listening to Bessie Smith, for example. So from as far back as 2010, he's really been prominent. And the first lesson that I got back then was that music has joy and pain in it. I've been working on that for a while because it's easy for me to see the pain side of things, right? The pain, the suffering that doesn't seem to change that much over time in Black culture and society. But the joy, the older I get, the more work that I connect with of Baldwin's, I see his laugh, I see his dance, I see his joy that existed alongside that pain. So Baldwin has opened a path for me to see joy alongside pain through his writing. But the second lesson is one that I didn't expect and didn't come easily. And so I wanted to share a video of a performance, an example of oral interpretation of literature that I did at the University of California, Merced in 2016. I was giving a talk there about my work on James Baldwin. And I'd already given my talk, I'd done my thing, like I know my stipend's on the way, I'm done, right? We're going to a museum and there's gonna be a screening of The Price of the Ticket, which is the first key biography of James Baldwin. So I'm thinking, all right, this is great. And we have the filmmakers there as well to do a Q&A. And I get introduced to them by my host, and they said, well, why don't you share some of the stuff that you shared with his students earlier? We know you did a performance, like, why don't you do a performance here too, to a totally separate audience, outside of academia? And I thought, I already did my work, and I'm getting paid for my work, and this is kind of extra, and I just wanted to relax now, enjoy. But then I heard kind of Baldwin in my ear, basically saying like, is this an opportunity? Is this an opportunity to continue to help people feel this experience in some way. So I'm going to show you a clip of this, and I will just mention that oral interpretation of literature is using performance to take all sorts of texts. It can be like a novel, it could be a list, it could be a letter, and really focusing on literary and linguistic and even like gestural techniques to bring it alive so that you can feel it more deeply, and so that maybe you have a different kind of experience of knowledge like from it. And so this is an example of oral interpretation of literature of Baldwin's work, of his short story, Sonny's Blues. The passage that I'm taking is maybe in the first third of the short story, and it is a very key moment of racial violence. It is a moment that is represented by Sonny and the unnamed brothers' uncle and father, and they're hanging out. You know, they're just on a hill, just hanging out, laughing, drinking, chatting, and something happens. A traumatic moment happens, which is, in my talk today, I mentioned that this is a trauma that is historical, that is recurring, that is violence on the black body. You mentioned earlier the 4 years, since Trayvon Martin, and I think it's certainly relevant to pick a passage like this that speaks about the violence on the black body that Baldwin is talking about in 1957, and that we're still talking about right now in our current time period of 2016. This keeps recurring, right? This is a trauma that keeps recurring. How do you get past trauma? You revisit it, you confront it, and you somehow try to break it apart. And that's what I think Baldwin tries to do in his literature. He puts it out there for us to kind of identify with it. And what I'm trying to do now with us is for us to confront that and perhaps use our different voices and our bodies to understand it a little bit better, at least. So that's a lot of talking, but we'll see what comes out of it, right? Okay. So I was trying to give you cues, but I'm going to start out. So the mother is she's just telling the story of her, who's her husband and also her brother-in-law. So I'm going to start off like that. And so again, I got the ooh. Okay, so that you guys, and then over here, back. So okay, good. And I'll give you the signals. All right, so we'll see how we work with that. Okay, so I'll start off. Saturday nights, him and your brother would drift around to different places, go to dances and things like that, or just sit around with people they knew. And your father's brother would sing. He had a fine voice. And he would play along with himself on his guitar. Keep it going. Well, this particular Saturday night, him and your father was coming home from someplace, and they were both a little drunk. And there was that moon that night. It was bright like that day. And your father, they were both a little drunk. So your father's brother was feeling kind of good, kind of frisky. And he was whistling to himself. And he had this guitar slung over his shadow, over his shoulder. And they was coming down a hill. So they was coming down a hill. And beneath them was a road that turned off from the highway. Well, your father's brother, being always kind of frisky like, decided to run down this hill. And he did. And that guitar, banging, and clanging. And he ran across the road, and he was making water behind the tree, and your father was sort of amused at him. And he was still coming down the road. Kind of slow. Keep it going. Then he heard a car motor. And that same minute, his brother stepped from behind the tree into the road and in the moonlight. And he started to cross the road. Bump, 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 bump. And your father, he started to run down the hill. Yeah. He started to run down that hill. And he started to cross the road. And he says he don't know why. This car is full of white men. This car was full of white men. They was all drunk. And when they seen your father's brother, they let out a great whoop. Woo! And a holler. And they aimed the car straight at him. They was having fun. They just wanted to scare him. The way they do sometimes, you know? They was having fun. They just wanted to scare him. And the way they do sometimes, you know? But they was drunk. Yes, they was drunk. And I guess the boy being drunk too. But and scared. That boy lost his head. Your father says he heard his brother scream, "Woo!" Your brother says he heard his brother scream when the car broke over him, and he heard the wood of that guitar when he did, and he heard them strings go flying, and he heard them white men shouting. As he heard the white men shouting, and the car kept going, kept going. And it ain't stopped till this day. And time your father got down the hill, his brother were nothing but blood and pulp. So, the second lesson. The second lesson that James Baldwin taught me was that sometimes you have to answer the call, right? I was in the audience, I'd done my duty. I was uncomfortable with adapting. I had done a solo performance earlier in the day, and I wanted to create a different experience, something that would be impactful for this different audience. That was the first time that I tried to make a collaborative performance. And I had to improvise all of that. And I had to do it from my phone because I wasn't expecting to have to present anymore. So that was all like an example of improvised adjusting, you know? And it's a lesson, and also, I guess, a vote of confidence that James Baldwin kind of gave me because he first prompted it. So I just wanted to show you the text too, because the thing about like oral interpretation of literature and also a certain type of writing is that you can bring it alive with music, with gesture, with pronunciation, and sometimes the writing is just so good that you don't need any of that. And I feel that with James Baldwin's work all of the time. But it's easy, it's helpful to draw on some of these other tools to get it in your own body and to understand a little bit better. So those were the kind of three questions that we mostly kind of started off with. And we have some time if you all have questions of us, or if you would like to share some of the ways that James Baldwin has inspired you or influenced you. I don't think we have a mic to go around, but if you would like to ask a question or to make a comment, please feel free to stand up and project your question, and we'll respond. Would anybody like to add to the conversation about lessons James Baldwin has taught us, or ways that he's influenced us, or if you have any questions of us?
I had a question for any of y'all, but when I first heard of James Baldwin, I was really drawn to how he wrote about love, and I was wondering if you all had any takeaways from how James Baldwin thought about love that influenced your trajectory as in your career, just as a human being.
I can definitely take that. Okay. No, absolutely. I would say for me, one of the more important passages that is like him talking about love that bleeds into my own love life, but also, you know, bleeds outside of this concept of love. And we obviously shared a James Baldwin class, so I can speak directly. But in Giovanni's room, when he's talking about, you know, people can't unhappily invent their mooring posts, right? And they, you know, kind of God gives these and takes them away, and like all you can kind of do is say yes to life. You know, certainly in my own personal relationship with my wife, I mean, like that, you know, like that timing isn't always, you know, sometimes it takes a lot to be able to say yes to life. And I would say, you know, that's obviously in the context of my own personal relationships, but I would also say that that encapsulates my approach to creative writing, right? I mean, I think even whether it's this project or the previous project, is trying to like honor those mooring posts as they appear in all of their imperfection, and to say yes to them, right? Even if a work or an idea comes to you and feels like it's not quite what I was like interested in, you know, or but if it's there, there's a need to say yes to life, and anything other than that kills you. You know, and that's certainly, I mean, that's something Baldwin has said from many different angles and many different ways, but that's the line that sticks out to me the most.
Well, oh, that's cool. I don't know. I would just think that we all want to be loved. Everybody wants to be loved, and I'm sure that was one of his motivating, you know, factor in just in life. I would say just as an artist, I'm always thinking about love. You know, in the end, whatever it is that I'm creating, in the end, we're all just energy, whatever that is, no matter what you believe or don't believe. And when I'm performing, I'm just trying to get that energy out to touch people, which I guess, for lack of a better word, is love. So, you know, if he's writing, I'm sure he's trying to convey that. You know, of course, there's a lot of pain. You can't know what love is without pain. You can't know what life is, you know, without pain. So I would just say that's just a general theme for everybody, is love.
I like how Baldwin's love, or conceptualization of love, is really complicated. You know, it's like you can love someone but also feel anger and frustration, and his relationship with the United States, for example, his relationship with his father, his relationship with religion, with Christianity specifically, all very tense relationships, but there was always love there. So, I mean, the lesson for me is that your love can be complicated. That's okay, but be open to it and listen, you know, as part of that. And I think he was a big proponent of bringing different people and different perspectives together to like listen to each other and to like start off with the default as love as opposed to hate, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring Baldwin back into our atmosphere, you know, our environment here, especially this year, because of just the political climate of so much divisiveness and hatred, right? If you start with a default of openness, of listening, and of love, then maybe you can kind of have a conversation about stuff and learn stuff and kind of address some of these borders, you know, that we've put between each other. Thanks for the question. Any other comments or questions or, yes?
I got a question about, I got a question about Baldwin as a public intellectual. I mean, where would you place him in the spectrum of like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X? Not quite someone who maybe drew crowds, but where is, beyond the literary, where is he in the sense of a public intellectual that we sort of don't see nowadays?
I think, especially in his work in France and outside of the US more broadly, that he was really, you know, people would come to him to be the face of what does race look like in the United States. So he really had to take on that role sometimes when he wanted to be about the writing and he didn't want to be boxed in as a black writer or an American writer. He managed to meet those needs as well as expand, you know, beyond those expectations. So especially outside of the United States, I think he's someone that people kind of came to say, what's happening in the US, you know? And in the United States, there's a lot of attention to him, but then sometimes there's a push back against him, especially like later, like in his career. So did you have more to add on that one, Ricardo? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes. Yeah, he did not imagine himself as Malcolm or Martin, you know, and that was not his comfort zone, and he imagined himself as a recorder, certainly. And I think in Evidence, the book that I mentioned, kind of in the lead up, Evidence for Thing Not Seen, which comes at the end of his career, which comes, you know, after the Black Arts movement and a lot of younger intellectuals kind of cast Baldwin aside. Great number, many who are, you know, talking at his funeral when they realize what, you know, what they have missed in him. But even in that book, he speaks, you know, he bridges the gap between Malcolm and Martin. And, you know, to go back to this notion of love, he's able to love them both and demonstrate to folks either outside of a culture or within the culture who don't quite understand how that all made sense. And in terms of Malcolm, you know, he writes the script for Spike Lee's Malcolm X, you know, battles with the estate and otherwise, you know, like that gets credited as something else, but Spike will be the first to tell you that, you know, all of that comes from Baldwin, right? And I think that's like, for me, one of my, you know, we get these kind of pet peeves in our own scholarship is that late Baldwin is to be paid attention to, right? It's easy to just say, let's sit with the comfortable stuff. Let's sit with, you know, with the 50s and go tell it, and Giovanni's Room in another country, and you know, we can keep going. But you know, he was constantly evolving, and he was evolving with them. And I think he understood the responsibility of having outlived both Malcolm and Martin, and needing to set that record straight in terms of what that was.
Can you repeat that reference, the later book?
The evidence of things not seen. It may show up outside your desk, I mean outside your office. But.
Any other comments or questions? Yes.
How do you think he would respond to what you're talking about, polarization, anti-intellectualism, banning books, and so forth? How would he write or maybe teach a class today, do you think? Because you all have studied him and was following on his side.
Well, I would say it's more of the same, personally. I mean, I would say it's like a broken record. The times that we are in now, one of the other reasons I turned to Baldwin is because he's often writing in a time of like great crisis. And so I see it as very applicable to now. I'm sure he would probably be disheartened that it's so similar to the times that he's writing from, but yeah.
I can answer that too if you want.
Oh, sure.
I mean, is that okay? I mean, I think, like, again, not to send you all home with a book, but he ends that particular book, and, you know, this is, which we see is going on at the same time when DL writes this, right? But this is the Reagan era that we're in the middle of, South Africa, you know, apartheid and whatnot, but it's dealing on, I won't get into the weeds on the case in Atlanta, but it basically, he ends it by saying, like, the person who commits the crime, right? Like, he, she, it, government, whatever, like, they're gonna get, like, they know what they did, but, like, you know, it's the folks who kind of allow the crime and are complicit in that, and again, who seek safety rather than love, which means taking full responsibility. So whether it's, you know, our current political climate, whether it's, you know, all the nonsense going on in the Middle East, I think he would force us to look internally at our own complicity, without a doubt.
Yes. Yeah, I'd be interested how you feel there's a particular work by Baldwin that's impacted you, and in what sense? Like more than the others?
Well, for me, Sonny's Blues is an obvious one. Yeah. I don't know if you all had things to add.
Could you repeat the question?
You asked what work from Baldwin or works from Baldwin most impacted us so deeply. And I mentioned Sonny's Blues again. Yeah.
I would just say, go tell it on the mountain is first. That would, you know, it's like, wow, you're brilliant. You're a different kind of thing. Excuse me. Yeah, go tell it on the mountain. You're a different kind of thinker, which, once again, I have to go back to music because everything is, for me, is music. And when you have, to me, a measure of a great person, and like I said, I relay everything to music. It's not like an incredible musician like that I played with, McCoy Tyner. He changed the way people think about piano. To me, that's how you influence people. And Baldwin, with, you know, that first novel, it changed the way people thought or looked at writing or whatever it is. You know, it's almost like a sort of a gene tumor from the Harlem Renaissance, where it was a totally different way of looking at things. And his intellect and storytelling, and it's just, to me, a great person is able to change how you view the world in a literary sense.
as much as I've been touting evidence, and it's an important book for me. I mean, my life would be very different without Giovanni's Room. So I'm not sure if you've read it, but I would. Yeah, and for me, I think I understood as like I mean, I'm old. I was old, or I was like older than I was past college, but I'm old now. I was a young man back then, and I understood how.
No, I'm old.
I understood how revolutionary it was. And here you have a book supposedly without blackness, although I've always made the argument that James Baldwin is in there, but that's a story for another day, but supposedly without blackness that encapsulate that. And he caught a lot of hell for that, right? And it's always interesting from because it wasn't, I remember Stokely Carmichael, goes on to be Kwame Ture, obviously, was one of the few kind of Black Power intellectuals who understood what that book meant when it came out, right, and the relationship they had. But to me, that book is tremendous, right, for how revolutionary it is, and not in a kumbaya, post-racial kind of way. I mean, it is about blackness in so many ways, but it's about so much else. And so, like, for me, it all starts with that. But that's just when it hit me in my life. So.
I thought of another answer, an additional text that was really influential for me, and that's Notes of a Native Son, a collection of essays, really instrumental to my research. Some of the essays like Encounter on the Seine, Black Meets Brown, in terms of thinking about the difference between African American experience and history and other people of African descent in France. So shedding a light on that for me. The essay, Discovery of What It Means to Be American, thinking about like when he listens to Bessie Smith's song and he's just like, I finally knew what it was to be, and I won't repeat the N-word, but basically I finally discovered what it was to be racialized as a Black person by listening to a song, like the power of music, again, kind of coming through his literature. So that collection has been very impactful too. Any other questions or comments? Well, I have one more slide. And this is just some facts, some events happening if you want to stay Baldwin connected. So this library in itself is a wonderful resource. We've got both of the films. I think they're streaming. I Am Not Your Negro, I'm Not, yeah, and I Am also Price of the Ticket. Those are both at the library. I'm pretty sure that the library has all of the biographies, especially the more recent one by Eddie Globe. There is the James Baldwin Review, which is a journal that started about 8 years ago. That is all Baldwin, right? All Baldwin, things of Baldwin. And I had the opportunity to collaborate with 2 former students in my James Baldwin song course on an essay in one of those issues from 2022. But each issue is solely on James Baldwin, so you can check out those things. And lots of resources at the library, but also I just wanted to note these. So the special collections upstairs, the James Baldwin exhibition, my own tutorial, no shout out meant, but just so you know, I have a tutorial in the spring called James Baldwin Song. It's designed for freshmen and sophomores primarily, where we read James Baldwin's work and we get inspired and we write music based on his work. Mass Mocha right now has an amazing exhibition from Steve Locke that is called The Fire Next Time. It's going through November, so please check that out if you can get there. And the New York Public Library has a couple of exhibitions and a walking tour, and that's just the surface. I'm sure there are things that I wasn't aware of, things happening all year. Please keep Baldwin's spirit alive. I mean, I think we kind of need it at this time to draw on the love in his literature, the look at ourselves first before kind of thinking about the changes that need to be made in the world. And I hope that I've given you a little bit of a prompt to think about like James Baldwin, even now, 100 years later. Please feel free to have coffee and tea and cake and to converse a little bit. And thank you so much for coming, and happy birthday, James Baldwin.